Okay, so thank you everyone for coming this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Bethan Timmins. I'm the Managing Director of Equal Experts Australia and New Zealand. And with me today, I've got Tony Nguyen. Tony, give us a wave. Paul Timmins and Mark Tranter. Thanks, guys, for coming on board today. So today's expert talks, we're going to talk to you about you build it, you run it. And we're going to talk about what does it mean to an engineer or a delivery principal and a transformation expert on you build it, you run it. So I'm going to start by getting everyone to just do a quick introduction to themselves, and then we'll kick straight in. So Tony, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I'm Tony Nguyen. I run our delivery and transformation practice for APAC. The majority of my career has been in software product development. And then over the last 6 or 7 years, I spent more time doing transformation work at a lot of the big, large banks and organizations in Australia.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. Paul?
Hi there. I'm a consultant at Equal Experts. I've been in IT for about 18 years, been more focused on test and release a lot of that time, but then moved into sort of delivery and delivery lead roles, sort of running scrums or multiple scrums or whatever framework is being used. And that's what I'm currently up to now with one of our clients. I've been working across multiple industries.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. And Mark?
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark. I'm a principal consultant with Equal Experts. My background is predominantly in software development, moved much more into DevOps and software engineering role probably in the last 6 or 7 years. I've been with Equal Experts around 3 or 4 years, I think now, on quite a few different clients, predominantly with a lot of scale-ups.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. So I'm just going to start off this evening by just giving a bit of an introduction to you build it, you run it, and just making sure that everyone's clear about what it is, and then go into a little bit of detail around some of the practices that we actually cover as part of the you build it, you run it playbook. So you build it, you run it is a modern operating model, and it's a de facto name really for an on-call product team that owns all aspects of on-call and custom delivery and custom digital services. And they do that from inception right the way through to the decommission of their service. So they would launch to live traffic, they would monitor customer behaviors, they'd respond to production incidents, and you build it, you run it really transforms technology operations from that reactive ticket management approach to a proactive continuous improvement approach. So when you're transitioning from you build it, you run, from ops run it to you build it, you run it, it is actually quite a challenging process. And there's no kind of repeatable recipe in order for you to do that, because every organization is different and it has its own unique context. But what we can try and do is just offer like a simplistic heuristic view of that. And that describes a sequencing of events that you can do within you build it, you run it to adopt it effectively. And those of what we've highlighted are some of the practices that we put in place within our playbook. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus around, so these are the practices that you may see if you ever go to our playbook. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on 3 specific practices. We're going to start one on the selection practice. And then we're going to talk a little bit more around operational enablers. And lastly, we're going to finish actually in measurement. And we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to just start by actually looking at the selection practice. And that selection practice refers to that initial selection of the operating model for your service. So it's not a one size fits all across your organization. It's on a service by service basis. And to help understand which operating model is best for your software service, we follow these selection practices. So looking at selecting the availability target on financial exposure, selecting your deployment target on feature demand, and then lastly, selecting a higher availability target when we need to factor in things like peak exposure. And then based on those results, we either select a you build it, you run it for anything which has the 99.99% availability, or we would select you build it, you run it for digital services, or we would recommend you go in for a traditional ops run it for those foundational systems. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of the selection practices. So I'm actually going to start with you, Tony. Tony, it'd be good if you could tell us a bit about your experiences when helping customers select the right operating model for their service.
Sure. So we do have some startup, scale-up type clients that are digital and cloud native, and they tend to go straight to you build it, you run it. The majority of the experience I've got is helping larger organizations start that transition and choose which services. As a generalization, the pattern we tend to see in the majority of our large enterprises is they still keep a centralized ops team for their core commercial off-the-shelf type applications, and then they start to migrate to a you build it, you run it model for their digital services. So they're essentially running in a hybrid model. And when you're thinking about selecting which digital services to start that transition with, you kind of take into account two main things we look at is firstly, how expensive is it if there is a failure? And then how frequently you need to release that service and get features out on it. There's actually quite a good selector in the playbook that will kind of help walk you through that. Let me give you an example. So we work with an Australian retailer, and when we were going through the digital services that they had, we kind of used a red, amber, green categorization to work out which ones we'd transition. So red was any service that required deployments less than a fortnight. So it only needs to release 2 weeks or more. We just left that with the centralized ops team. And then the green stuff was, hey, any service that required deployments weekly or more frequently. And then you kind of got left with this amber section, which was like the in-between. And to use a tiebreaker, what we did was we looked at the service availability. So any service that required more than 99.9% availability is something that we'd actually move across and prioritize. I think the important note is, yes, you can select it, but it's also, you don't have to boil the ocean and you still need to prioritize those services anyway.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. Paul, as a delivery lead, have you had any similar experiences with about how you help or work with your product managers or your existing incident managers with how they can go about selecting the right operating model?
I'm putting myself on mute, that's typical. Yeah, to follow on from what Tony was saying, I mean, obviously there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. I mean, if you've got things which are, the off-the-shelf applications that don't normally change much, then or don't, or have very infrequent changes, then maybe once it's in place and it doesn't change much, then having a team that look after that and basically, that would be considered a more traditional model. Where the experience I've had with sort of new teams or building new stuff is twofold, really. I mean, when you're in a startup, yes, you can set off in this direction, and there is no ops team, there is no external parties. You're pretty much building it. The people who are building it are the ones who know most about it and are able to work closely with the product owners to deliver the value. I think where it can be a bit more challenging in the environments where there are established ops teams and there's established change management processes, and owning the release process as a local team or owning the operations and the support of that can seem a bit, well, this hasn't been the way it's worked up until now. So in my experience for that is, often some of the foundation practices which you put in place which allow you to move towards this, which are, in my mind, sort of things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, automation, test coverage, having a solid foundation. Building that in establishes a strong development practice, which allows you to sort of move. So even if you're existing in an environment where you've got that, but you're still working with external teams for sort of change management or support, over time, it's more of a show, don't tell sort of thing, where you can actually, you start to establish confidence in what you're doing and the practices you've put in place. So sometimes if you're finding some friction, or it's harder to, or you're implementing it in something which is an existing landscape, then I find that trying to establish yourself and build confidence in what you're doing makes a much easier journey. So like I was saying, it's not something you want to try and solve the world or boil the ocean to do, whereas maybe sometimes smaller steps can get you there. That's my experience.
And Mark, so from a team perspective or an engineer's perspective, like what part do they play in actually helping to select the right operating model?
Sure. So a lot of the metrics and data points that go into feeding into the model that Tony and Paul have been through around when you're going to choose a you build it, you run it, or an ops build it, you run it model. A lot of those metrics and those data points have to come from the engineering team to give ideas on effort for the availability bands. So if you want to run some service at 5 nines, well, what's some t-shirt size of the cost for the development team to build the service to that level of availability? You might want to know how much of the product is currently just being served via off-the-shelf product and how much actually is custom digital services. How much re-architecture would be involved with any existing stuff. So you may have, especially with a traditional monolithic app, with a traditional ops deployed from ops model, you may want to look at how much effort is going to be involved in moving that to a more cloud-native 12-factor app kind of a setup. Obviously, the business wants to know what the costs of these things are going to be before they embark on such a big journey. But also, I think a big one is cultural, like how able and willing are the team to move to this model. I'd want to get the team's opinion on that pretty early on in the piece. So do they have the expertise? Are they comfortable writing infrastructure as code, automating infrastructure deployments, automating code deployments? And how willing are they to do it? Is that something that they actually want to do? Do they see the value in that for themselves? And of course, are they keen to be a part of the support roster?
Yeah, cool. All really good points, Mark. I think one of the things that we highlight within our operating model playbook is about using our operations or working out which operating model based on the level of insurance cover that you want for your business outcomes. So knowing how much effort and value you need to put in to make that happen really figures out whether is that effort worth the investment that you're going to put in for the outcomes that you're trying to insure against. So for example, things that you're not going to change that often, that you don't need a high availability for, why would you put all of that effort in up front compared to those that you actually, you should probably put that effort in because the impact on your business is much higher if that service goes down or you can't get features out to customers. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Excuse me one second. I'm just going to open a window in the room I'm in. I've got my door closed and I'm locked away from my kids and it's getting very hot in here. Got the lamp in my face.
So the next one I want to talk about here is you build it, you run it as an operational enabler practice. And this one really here is all about the practices that allow on-call product teams to really collaborate effectively with their operational enabler teams. And that it could include in things like integrating your digital services into your service management processes for change management, incident management, or more of that. Or it could be looking at working with specialized teams, so such as your database administrators or network administrators and that type of thing. And Paul, you touched on it actually in a little bit in your last talk, but tell us a little bit about your experience with implementing the practices around operational enablers.
So again, I would come back to, and with this regard, I mean, I always think back to the reason why a lot of these traditional things exist, in particular as having a support team, right, to look after the systems, having a change management process, having a release management process, or all of these things that exist in these teams that grew up and these industries that grew up around it and all of their frameworks. We've got to remember the reason why that sort of it was in place, right? Because it was in place for like an assurance of what was going to happen and to protect the integrity of the business, to ensure that the running of the business wasn't interrupted by an IT problem, right? So everyone probably remembers back in the day when deployments would happen and everything would break and it was, well, we've had an upgrade or we're having to roll back or something. And you had the middle of the night deployments and all these sort of things. I'm sure a lot of people will have that experience. So I often find that when we move to these sort of more like sort of faster releases, initially people think, well, it's almost counterintuitive to people who have come through it from that old mentality or old experience from them, where a change to a system was seen as being risky. Therefore, it was a lot more process was around it. People were less inclined to do it because there was a lot more effort. So I think, again, it comes back to my mind. In my mind, a lot of this stuff comes from show, don't tell. So we can talk till we're blue in the face around how we can achieve the same level of confidence through tooling, through better monitoring and alerting than we've previously had, and we can really use these tools to get there. But a lot of it comes back to actually, you know, just going through that process and showing that we're able to do that, and, you know, deploying low risk repeatable changes, as it says on the slide here. I mean, pushing out changes as they're ready, having really strong test coverage in place so that you know that you're not breaking anything. You've got your regression, you've got your new features that are being tested, and you're releasing them. But another one for that is, this is one that always sticks out to me, and something I always find speaking to some development teams I've worked with even recently, where people, well, it's ready, let's ship it. You know, and it's like, well, yeah, that's fine, but we've got to remember that we're delivering the changes that we're delivering are being delivered to customers, or they're being delivered to, you know, the business. So, I mean, using feature flags to disable or to enable control when we enable features, and really breaking that deployment of code from the deployment of a function or a feature to the business, to put that in the hands, remains in the hands of the business, right? Who have concerns around readiness, training, promotions, you know, all of these things, sales events, which might drive the enablement of a feature. And I think that's been a key thing of making sure that the development teams are really thinking about that when we're building it, so that we're not surprising anyone when we're going live with regular changes, that suddenly something works in a different way. But just so I won't go on for too long, but just to touch on these other points, as well as, yeah, integrating with incident management. I found that at one place where I worked, where once we realized that we could still actually generate, what we cared about was having traceability, right? And they didn't want to go on, well, we said, well, we have traceability because you can check from Jira to the Git commit to the CI/CD pipeline, which shows the deployments and all of the artifacts are there. And they're like, but we all use ServiceNow, right? Well, that's how we track it. So we integrated with ServiceNow. We generated records. We linked back to change records that we had. So that's some of my experience. And I think if anyone's interested, I did post. I put something in the playbook about an experience I had around deploying small enough changes, and so far as we were able to actually almost re-platform a sales platform under small routine changes. And people afterwards were coming asking, well, when are you ever going to go live with us? And we were like, we've been live with us for quite some time, because we were working closely with the product owners who were happy to take the changes, happy to roll it out. And all the external change management or ops team were seeing was these routine changes happening, and weren't really sure, didn't realize that a large number of routine changes can lead up to actually significant system changes.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Mark, as an experienced engineer, what things do you do to automate the change process?
Yeah, so that was great, Paul, and I'm sure your thoughts on a lot of that. You mentioned a couple of things: protecting the integrity of the business, which has led to a lot of manual control gates. So the industry's moved along a lot in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And there's been a lot of tech enablers that have allowed us to automate a lot of these control gates away. So as an engineer, what do I automate? Well, as much as possible. So I think when you're first starting out on your new build that you're running, or your DevOps or your continuous delivery journey, at a minimum, you want to be able to automate everything that's required to get code from source control into a production environment. And that they are those control gates that were the manual control gates in the old world. So to build a good continuous delivery pipeline, you want to be able to fail really fast. So if something's going wrong in your code, you want to pick it up as early as you can, possibly as early as you possibly can. So all your cheap quality control gates you should put up front. So your CI pipeline, building the code, compiling, unit tests. Something that's really good is, and it's a bit of a cliche now, which is shifting left on security. So things like if you have, and I highly recommend doing this, which is putting your infrastructure as code, whether that's Terraform or Pulumi or Cloud Development Kit or whatever it is, and putting static analysis rules over your infrastructure code, also separating that infrastructure code out into modules so that you can have a module that says, look, if we need a Postgres database, this is the way we, as a company inside our digital platform, set up a Postgres database with some sensible defaults. And that's all been checked and could potentially even be audited by some security team. We want to automate deployments to lower environments. And we want to make sure that those deployments to the lower environments are identical to the deployments to production, because we want to test the deployment, which is as important as testing the code.
Yeah, yeah.
We automate smoke tests, functional tests, performance testing, and of course we want to automate the production deployment.
Yeah.
Now there's a whole set of automation that's done on either side, both on the left of the value stream, on the right of the value stream of CI. So on the right, sort of once you're in production, you want to make sure you can automate things like rollback. You want to make sure you've got all logging, tracing, monitoring, alerting all set up. You want kind of a paved road template service for all of your feature teams to be able to use to deploy into production with minimal fuss. Look at things like synthetic testing to catch regressions and performance degradations, hopefully before the users. Canary testing, which comes back to something Paul mentioned, which was decoupling the release from the deployment. So that is, I want to be able to deploy some change into my production environment, but I don't want to release it to my actual users. I would like to be able to have internal users, for example, be able to use it, or automated canary tests to be able to use that new functionality. On the extreme left, on the far left of your delivery cycle, you want to look at things like automating developer onboarding, right? That can ensure that you've got auditable, repeatable, secure processes for onboarding developers so that they're productive from day one. And developer tooling, so really good developer tooling. That's the fastest feedback. If you can have developers know that some of the code isn't going to work, or that they've potentially they've written something that's potentially insecure. If you can let the developers know as they type that, that's the fastest feedback of all. So
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum now, to Tony, to talk about, well, we've talked about engineers and in delivery teams on how we manage that change. But as a transformation lead, how do you help organizations of a whole with that mind shift of change management when they're going from fortnightly to eventually daily or even multiple changes a day?
I'm still giggling it because when we asked Mark to be a panelist, he said, I'm not the best person for this because it's been so long since I've actually dealt in the you build it, you run it well without all the pipelines and everything else. So you went on for quite a while there, man, considering you didn't you had anything to talk about.
I do like automation.
I think from a mindset shift, Paul touched on it earlier, the one that I see the most and the biggest mind shift that organizations need to make is how they perceive risk. So one of the learnings that I've personally had recently in the last couple of years is particularly with our enterprise customers and our financial enterprise customers, is that speed in their mind equals risk. So you can imagine I'm in the middle of a pitch and we're talking to our clients about how Equal Experts can help you speed up your development and your deployments, and thinking that this was going to be a benefit to them that they want. And you could literally see the people in the room actively start cringing because they're all going, yeah, we don't want that. Right? So I think in this next example, I'm probably going to give away my age a little bit, but my background is product development, but COTS products. And this is back in the day when you actually had to burn it to CD. So big bang releases were actually the norm because you're restricted by the regularity of those release vehicles, right? And what always happened is, like, in that month before you're about to release and burn it to CD, like the product managers would always come up and go, hey, can we cram some more stuff in? And the reason they did that is because they've got another 6-month window before the next release vehicle. You can kind of imagine the problems that happen, right? Because all those last minute changes that they requested really late in the cycle was really buggy and destabilized the product. And what ended up happening is we either slipped the release date, or we then had to follow up really quickly afterwards with like a service pack, which we weren't planning on. And what we're still seeing in organizations is that we still have that same mindset of change is considered risky, so let's do it less often. but then those changes become even much larger and they become much riskier and they have a bigger blast radius. So you get into this kind of crazy spiral. So I think in terms of influencing the organization, one of my favorite techniques, regardless of whether we're talking about you build it, you run it, or any sort of changes, is being able to take the leadership team outside of their comfort zone and show them where things are good. So in this example, we wanted to take them to places where we can show that smaller, faster changes are actually a benefit rather than an inhibitor. And one of our favorite ways to do that before, back when we could kind of travel, is take them to another company. Like we used to fly execs to Silicon Valley, go take them into Amazon. And it's a very different beast when it's not you pushing it and it's they're hearing from their peers telling them, yeah, here are the advantages that we got out of it, right? And even nowadays, like when we've got new clients coming in, we introduce them to our old ones so they can actually hear the personal stories of other companies that have gone through it. And it becomes much more tactile and real rather than just you lecturing or preaching on it.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. So the next one we've got is around how the measurement practice. So how we go about measuring the operating model to decide if it's worthy of any further investment. And we want to look at things like the cost effectiveness of the business outcome protection. Is it informative? Can we get any like actionable measures from those operating models? And we're going to be looking at things like leading and trailing measures that can be used to really gauge that progress in the deployment throughput or the service reliability and that learning culture. And it's important to really like select the measures that are holistic, that are actionable, and that actually just don't create the wrong incentives. And you all know Steve Smith has written a great book on measuring continuous delivery. So I'd recommend a read of that. But for you, Mark, tell us a little bit about your experience with measuring throughput and also reliability within You Build It, You Run It.
Sure. So from an engineering perspective, the first thing you want to do is make sure that the data is available. So you don't want to just be logging to stand it out. You want to make sure that you've got contextual information available in all of your telemetry data. So that could be things like the version number or the commit hash of the change that's currently running. You want to have some sort of tagging taxonomy for your infrastructure so that you know, for example, what service a database belongs to. So if something goes wrong with that database or some alert goes off, you know which team to wake up at 2 in the morning. You want to make sure your telemetry data is accessible. So is it indexed? Is it searchable? Do you have it in Elasticsearch and viewable in Grafana, or is it in Prometheus and Kibana and so on? Do you have nice, visible, readily available dashboards that are easy to grok? So just at a glance, I can see if something's going wrong. Ensure that all the appropriate alerts are in place. So you want to integrate with Splunk on Call or OpsGenie or some of these systems that integrate with the rostering that can implement the rostering for you. And as far as possible, as much as possible, make sure that your alerts are actionable. So if it's you know, CPU is maxed out on some database, perhaps you can link to a run sheet that tells you how to scale up with your cloud provider to some larger database instance. And you want to instrument something that doesn't happen all that often is instrumenting your deployment pipelines. If you can instrument your deployment pipelines, and that can be just as simple as being able to grep the logs on your Jenkins server or something as a 101 version of deployment pipeline instrumentation. And you can start to manage things like deployment lead time, deployment frequency. I think some of the key metrics you just want to track, just off the top of my head, things like failure rate, so deployment failure rate, the percentage of deployments that lead to production failure, deployment lead time, deployment frequency, service availability. So we talked initially about availability, so we want 4 nines or 2 nines. There's no point setting those targets if we're not able to measure them. And ditto off the back of availability, you want time to restore. So if I do lose availability, how long is it taking me to get back to full availability?
Awesome, thanks, Mark. Tony, we talk about learning culture is needed for You Build It, You Run It, but that's actually a really hard thing to measure. What things would you say are good measurements or even indicators of a learning culture? You're on mute, Tony.
Sorry. When you think about like the primary benefits that we're looking to get out of you build it, you run it, like one of the biggest benefits I see is that the team gets way better insights because they're closer to the customer. There's no longer an ops intermediary, and they actually get to understand better how the customer's actually using what they've just built. And that learning loop is priceless because it drastically improves everything you build from that point forward. And it's kind of like compound interest that it keeps building on top of itself. So being able to measure that lead time of those feedback loops is probably one of the best ones. Like how quickly do we go from diagnosis to fix? And then even following that, how quickly is that information and what you just learned disseminated, not just amongst the team, but across the organization? So are we creating a culture where they're actively sharing and making it safe to fail and learn, or are they still kind of scared to share the dirty laundry? So looking at those kind of things.
Yeah, awesome. And Paul, where do you even start with all of these measuring practices?
Well, I think I mean in terms of the ones that Mark was discussing, then those measurements, obviously we need to come from what's important to the customer and what's important to the team, right? So what is the most important things? Because there's a lot of things that we can measure and there's lots of things that we can get data on, but what do people care about, right? So, and obviously that drives the priorities of, because all of this stuff that we're talking about takes effort to implement and it needs to be prioritized against a feature backlog and stuff. So when you're putting this stuff in, you need to be allowing for these things to be put in place as well. And I feel like you need to be measuring. I think you touched on incentivizing the right things, and often I've seen people like saying, "Oh, we deploy on every deployment we goes to production, always goes to production." I'm like, well, okay, that's fine, but I mean, it is that adding value, right? Is that adding value to your organization? I mean, is everything going to production and you've got high failure rates, or are you seeing bug fixes bugs coming back in that you need to resolve? Obviously, if that's a point where you can basically push things through again. One thing I find that if not done correctly, or you don't have good discipline within the team, or you're not feature flagging things, I've had people who've gone down this road, or we've started looking at things like this, and teams are like, well, we can't put this out because if we push, we can't fix this bug right now, because if we fix this bug in main, we've put all these other changes into our main branch, and now we can't release that, right? So there's certain discipline that needs to be in place before you go down this road, so that you don't find yourself in a position where you're actually limiting yourself. One of the things I find tends to be is more qualitative than quantitative, is people, like as a delivery lead, you deal with a lot of people who are under pressure to get things live. You deal with difficult conversations around when things are going to be ready, or what the expectations are for when these things are going to be ready. When this is done right, and you're in a good flow of delivering things, and things are being delivered, and there's not a lot of time being spent fixing stuff that's coming back from support, right? So we're not seeing these unplanned work or coming into sprint, then those sort of things tend to die down, right? You are delivering value, people are happy with what they're getting. They're in control because they're able to toggle things on and off. Like we were saying, is if you've feature flagged a new feature and you've got it out and then it gets turned on, and something is wrong with it, or the unintended consequence, then it can be turned off again, right? And then it becomes a lot less stressful for product owners when they're dealing with these rollouts, or they're going live with things, because they know we've got the ability to respond to it as well. So I think that's the key one for me. I know it's not just specifically around measuring. I've not given specific examples, but I think it is really what's important in the context of what you're delivering to what's there, and then looking at how best you sort of focus your measurements around that.
And I think you hit it there, right? If you start measuring what you do today and start really understanding what you do, it surfaces what you don't know. So a lot of the time there's assumptions being made about why things are not, and why deployment throughput is slow, or why service reliability is low. And by actually getting some measurements there, you've got some real data to understand, and then start prioritizing the things from that data that you need to be able to fix and to actually improve that pipeline or to improve that reliability. Then it's data driven rather than assumption driven. So some great points there, Paul. So I'm just going to ask each of you to give us one takeaway, really, what you would recommend for our people viewing today. So, Tony, what would be the takeaway you would offer in terms of selecting the right operating model?
It can appear daunting. So just don't get disheartened. You don't need to do everything at once. You don't need to entirely flip everything to the model. Prioritize the services. So find the one that you want to deliver the value to most frequently, or the one that you need available the most, and start there and just go from there.
Great. And Mark, how about you? What key takeaway would you offer for measuring you build it, you run it?
Yeah, so instrument everything possible, code, infrastructure, build pipelines, and take any learnings from failures or successes, but they'll predominantly be failures. Take any learnings from your failures back into your automated pipelines and your instrumentation to make sure that you can get that data as early as possible.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. And Paul, what would you say is the key takeaway in terms of operation enablers?
Yeah, I think for me, it always comes back to the show, don't tell, right? Is to try and, it's like I've mentioned it before, is to basically implement, you can put these practices in place which set you up for success in this model. But then you can basically work on trying to change the hearts and minds around people. And it's especially difficult when you've got big established support teams or ops teams that are currently in place who might see this as a bit threatening. There is one way that you can sort of include them into your process as well, so they can be more aligned, so that where they think, well, supports, we don't just respond to alerts and support's more to it than that, then you can actually get them to educate your team around, well, what is it about that? What is the relationship that you've got with your customers that we might not be seeing, that you might be able to add value to? And sometimes there's value in getting their input into your team, or even having them joining your team to offer what they can.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks. So we've mentioned the playbook quite a lot through this talk today. So here's a QR code if you can get your cameras ready. So scan this code and it'll take you straight to the playbook, and you can have a look at it here. So use it to your heart's content. I've got some more information around you build it, you run it. So not just the playbook, there's some blog articles, there'll be some videos and other case study content coming up. So if you want to read a bit more information around you build it, you run it, then yes, just scan this QR code and you can feed through into that. And thank you very much. Thanks, Tony, Paul, and Mark for being on the panel for us tonight. That was awesome. You're going to find a recording of this talk and details of any future talks. It'll be on our website. So go and have a look at equalexperts.com/expert/talks. And then our next talk is actually on Wednesday, June the 8th at 6 p.m. Australia time. And that's going to be by Nick Williams. And he's going to actually look at how to test infrastructure as code at scale. And is automation the answer for platform engineers? So any of you that's interested in that, then come along to that, our next talk. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing now and hopefully take some questions.
There is a Q&A panel down the bottom, guys, if you want to use that to ask questions.
Yeah.
I think there's one question in there already around compensation.
Yes, how do you compensate in a you build it, you run it model? Good question, Sheila. Firstly, the first thing is to ensure that you compensate anyone who's on call for you build it, you run it. You should be compensating people who are on a rota or on a rota anyway, irrespective of whether they're ops run it or you build it, you run it. So there's a section in our playbook all about effective ways to make sure you can compensate your developers and your developer teams and make sure that they feel like they've got a say in what it is they're doing as well.
Bitcoin.
I think it's an important one because I have heard I have experienced this where some people are, well, the team should just pick it up. But I think you've got to be realistic around what you're asking people. If you really value the continuity of your service and your IT, your services and your business, then you should. I think it's a professional approach is to compensate the engineers who are actually going to give you that reliability, resiliency out of hours, especially out of hours when you're expecting phones, maybe calls, alerts to go off at 4 a.m. and someone's going to pick up and respond to it.
Yeah, we have associates and consultants out there that you've got life outside of work, and one of ours at the moment is a really keen scuba diver, loves it, does a lot of underwater photography. So being on call means that he can't do that on a weekend at all, right? So that's taking that out of his life. So you just want to be able to make sure that you're compensating people just for it's an inconvenience.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is you can build a culture where the developers know that they're building quality into their product from the get-go. So I've worked as part of teams that knew their system was so good, they loved being on call because they were getting a flat rate, and they were really confident that they weren't going to get called out.
It's a good way to drive quality in. Yep.
Which
you don't want to be the one picking up the phone.
It's win-win for everyone, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, and essentially it's a cost for doing business. It's a cost for insurance. If you want somebody to be able to come out and be able to answer a call for you, you should pay for that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. What is a good time frame expectation for a transition through these models? Oh, Matt, I mean, the answer is it depends, right? There's so many various different factors in here. I mean, you could be looking at an organization that's really keen to move to this, and they've already got an adaptable architecture and they've got quite a lot of the things in place to be able to go. That's going to be much quicker than an organization that's doesn't really understand it, doesn't understand the move to it, can't see the benefits of it. They're in a monolith application and we've got to do a whole thing in there. So it really does depend on how many of those practices we're trying to implement to start with, what are the principles we're trying to get in place. And that could be anything from a couple of months to years down the line to get it really running and fine tuning. Anyone else got any answers to that?
No, I think when the example I was thinking of when I was talking about the show don't tell, I think is that was probably 6 to 12 months off before people really started to ease back, and then we and let us get on with it in terms of, and it wasn't just us as one team, it was a whole program of work. So there was probably about 10 teams who were now operating in this way, but it was in a much wider landscape where there was a lot of legacy going on as well. But yeah, we just kind of over time, over many months, everyone just sort of stopped worrying about what we were doing.
Great, awesome. Anyone else got any more questions? I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, all right. Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening, this afternoon, this morning. I've got to add that in because you're all around the world. Hope you're enjoying your breakfast there in the UK, and we're off to get a nice glass of wine or beer here in Sydney. Thank you everyone for coming.